In 1882, on the unforgiving plains of Texas, Clara May Fletcher learned a woman's worth could be measured in many ways. Cattle, land, or in her case, a single bag of rare coffee beans. She stood on the porch of Hutchinson's General Store, the sun beating down, her hands clutching a worn leather satchel. It held everything she owned. Inside, she could hear her brother Jeremiah's voice, bartering her away. "I'm telling you, Elias, she's a hard worker. Can cook, clean, mend clothes better than most." Clara closed her eyes. It sounded like he was selling a mule. At 26, she was a widow, a barren widow. Her first husband, Thomas, had left her the same week the doctor declared her unable to have children. "Barren as a winter field," he'd said. In a land where a family's future was built on the backs of its children, Clara was a failure. The store's bell chimed. Elias Boone stepped onto the porch. He was a tall man, 42, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and storm-cloud eyes that had seen too much sun. Silver streaked his temples. He looked tired, bone-tired. "Miss Fletcher," he said. His voice was quiet, respectful. Clara turned. "Mr. Boone, I suppose you'll be wanting to inspect the goods." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even hurt. "I don't reckon I need to inspect you like a horse, ma'am. Your brother told me what I need to know." From inside, the grinding of coffee beans was the only sound. A month's wages for most folks, that smell. "And what exactly did he tell you?" she asked, her chin held high. Elias took off his hat. "That you're a widow, that you can't have children." He said it without judgment. "That doesn't trouble me. I buried my wife and my baby boy 4 years ago. I'm not looking for more mouths to feed. I need someone to help me save what's left of my ranch." His honesty was a punch to the gut. Most men hid their failures. "Your ranch is in trouble," she stated. "Drought killed most of my cattle, the banks circling like vultures. I've got maybe 6 months." "Then why me?" "Because I can't do it alone," he said, his voice raw. "Can't afford help. And coming home to an empty house every night is a kind of hell. Your brother also made it clear that staying with him wasn't an option for you." Heat flooded her cheeks. Jeremiah had told him everything, about the bruises, about his new wife's cruel glares. The door creaked open. Jeremiah stood there, grinning, holding a burlap sack that smelled like heaven. "All settled then, Elias. You've got yourself a fine woman." Elias stepped between them, his shadow falling over Jeremiah. "I'll take good care of her. You have my word." The way he said it wiped the grin right off her brother's face. Without another word, Elias loaded her satchel into his wagon. As Clara climbed up, she saw the town gossips, Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Carmichael, watching from across the street, their heads bent together. By sundown, everyone would know. Clara May Fletcher traded for coffee beans. Let them talk, she thought. "It's about 2 hours to my place," Elias said, guiding the horses out of town. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of things unsaid. "Mr. Boone," she finally said, her eyes fixed on the dusty road, "what do you expect of me?" "My duties." He didn't answer for a long time. The wagon wheels creaked. The world was nothing but prairie grass and endless sky. "I expect you to help run the ranch, cook, clean, tend the garden. In return, you'll have a roof, food, and no one raising a hand to you." He said that last part so quietly she almost missed it, but she didn't. Jeremiah had told him everything. And marital duties? The question came out as a whisper. He was quiet again. Then, "I reckon that's something we'll figure out as we go. I'm not in the habit of forcing myself on women." Relief washed over her so powerfully it left her dizzy. She had prepared for the worst, for a man who saw her as property. Instead, she found a man who understood dignity. But as the wagon rolled on, a strange feeling crept into her heart. He was too calm, too respectful. Men who were desperate enough to trade for a wife weren't usually this decent. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up. The Boone Ranch was worse than she'd imagined. The house sagged. The fence was more broken than whole. The big barn listed to one side like a sinking ship. A few chickens pecked at the dust. It wasn't just a failing ranch. It was a dying one. "It's not much to look at," Elias said, his voice flat. "But the bones are good." Clara climbed down, the wind whipping dust around her ankles. It smelled of decay, of dreams turning to dust. "I built it with my wife, Sarah," he said, nodding toward the house. "We planned on 6 kids. The finest cattle operation in 3 counties." His voice was tight, controlled. This place wasn't just a ranch. It was a graveyard of hopes. Inside, the house was surprisingly clean, but empty. A man's house. A lonely man's house. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," he said, setting down her bag. "You can take the one facing east. I'm down the hall." He wasn't assuming they'd share a bed. Again, the decency. It felt wrong. It felt like a performance. "The 3rd room," he hesitated, turning away. "It was meant to be the nursery. You can use it for sewing, maybe." The pain in his voice felt real, but the house itself felt like a stage. Everything was a little too neat for a man grieving alone for 4 years. The floors were swept. There was no layer of dust on the mantel. It looked like he'd been expecting company. Not a wife, but an inspector. "Show me the kitchen," she said, "and tell me about the animals." He led her through the house. The kitchen had a good stove, a deep sink. Through the window, she saw a bare patch of earth. "Sarah's garden," he explained. 12 head of cattle left, he continued. 6 chickens, 2 horses, and 1 ornery goat. He laid out the grim reality of his situation. The bank man, a Mr. Jackson, was coming in a few weeks. He was looking for any excuse to foreclose. They needed $2,000 to stop him, an impossible sum. "Well then," Clara said, rolling up her sleeves, "we'd better get to work." A flicker of something in his eyes. Hope? Or was it relief? Relief that she was falling for the story. "You don't have to start today," he said. "Mr. Boone, I was traded for coffee beans. The least I can do is earn my keep." She started looking for the cleaning supplies. For the first time, he smiled. A real smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "In that case, Mrs. Boone, the soap is in the pantry." Mrs. Boone. The name felt strange. She went into the pantry, a small, dark room at the back of the kitchen. It was cool inside, and it smelled faintly of bleach, as if something had been recently and furiously scrubbed from the floorboards. She looked down. The wooden planks were lighter in one corner, almost white against the aged wood around them. Someone had cleaned something here, something more than spilled flour. Her hand went to her throat. She backed out of the pantry slowly. Elias was watching her from the doorway of the main room, his face unreadable in the dim light. The smile was gone. He knew she'd seen it. The silence stretched. The house was no longer just empty. It was full of secrets, and she was standing right in the middle of them. That night, Clara lay awake in her new room, listening to the house groan and settle. She heard Elias moving around downstairs long after he should have been asleep, pacing, back and forth, like a caged animal. The next morning, he was different. The quiet, weary rancher was gone. In his place was a man with an edge, a tension in his shoulders. His eyes followed her everywhere. "We need to fix the fence by the north pasture," he said over breakfast. His voice was clipped, businesslike. "And the well pump is sputtering, needs a new gasket." It was a list of chores, but it felt like a test. He was watching to see how she'd react. If she'd ask questions, she didn't. She just nodded, her heart pounding a steady, fearful rhythm against her ribs. They worked all day under the hot Texas sun, repairing fences, tending to the scrawny cattle. He worked with a desperate energy, as if physical labor could keep the ghosts at bay. Clara worked just as hard, her mind racing. What had been spilled on the pantry floor? Why had he scrubbed it so clean? And where was Sarah Boone, really? The story of the fever felt thin now, a convenient explanation for a wife and child who were simply gone. Late in the afternoon, while Elias was on the far side of the property, Clara went back to the house. She told herself it was to start supper, but she knew she was lying. She went straight to the third bedroom, the nursery. It was empty, save for a simple wooden rocking chair in the corner. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the window. The air was stale, still. She ran a hand along the wall. The wallpaper was faded, tiny bluebirds on a yellowed background. Her fingers caught on something, a loose flap of paper near the floor. She peeled it back carefully. Underneath, scratched into the plaster of the wall, were words. A single sentence, barely legible. He's not who he says he is. Find the box. Clara's blood ran cold. It was a woman's handwriting, Sarah's, a warning from beyond the grave. She pressed the wallpaper back into place, her hands trembling. A box. What box? Where? She looked around the small, empty room, the rocking chair, the dusty floor. Nothing. Then her eyes fell on the floorboards beneath the chair. One of them looked different. The nail heads weren't as rusted as the others. They were newer. She knelt down, her dress pooling in the dust. Using her fingernails, she pried at the edge of the board. It was stiff, but it moved. Slowly, it lifted. Underneath, nestled in the dark space between the joists, was a small tin box. It was a simple lock box, the kind you might keep recipes or letters in. It wasn't locked. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the lid. Inside there were no letters, no recipes. There was a stack of money. More money than she had ever seen in her life. At least $1,000, maybe more. And underneath the money, why, was a pistol. A small, pearl-handled Derringer. Loaded. And beneath the pistol was a newspaper clipping. It was yellowed and brittle with age. Dated 5 years ago, from a newspaper in San Antonio. The headline read, "Bank robbery in San Antonio. Deputy killed. Suspect Elijah Boone escapes." Below the headline was a drawing, a sketch of a younger man with dark hair and a grim set to his jaw. It was him. It was Elias. Clara slammed the box shut. Her mind reeled. Elias Boone wasn't a grieving rancher. He was a fugitive. A killer. This ranch wasn't a home. It was a hideout. The story about his wife and child, the drought, the bank, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed cage. And he had just locked her inside it with him. She heard the back door of the house open and close. He was back. She scrambled to put the box back, to fit the floorboard into place, to push the rocking chair over it. She stood up, brushing dust from her dress, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had to get out. She had to run. She turned to leave the room and froze. Elias was standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the rocking chair, at the faint outline of the disturbed floorboard underneath. His storm cloud eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. The exhaustion was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was ice. "You shouldn't have done that, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The friendly, broken rancher was a mask, and she had just ripped it off. Now she was face to face with the man underneath. A man who had killed before. A man with nothing left to lose. "What's in the box, Elias?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She already knew the answer. It was blood money. He took a step into the room. The door clicked shut behind him. "That's my business. My past." The newspaper clipping. The deputy. His jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. A different life. You lied to me, she said, backing away until her legs hit the wall. Everything is a lie. Sarah, did she die of a fever? He didn't answer. He just watched her, his expression a cold, hard mask. That was answer enough. Sarah hadn't died of a fever. Sarah had found the box. Sarah had learned the truth. And Sarah was gone. What did you do to her, Elias? Sarah understood things, he said, his voice low and menacing. She understood that sometimes you have to make difficult choices to survive. She was a good partner. The way he said partner made Clara's skin crawl. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a business arrangement, and Sarah had broken the terms. You need to understand, Clara, he continued, taking another step closer. This ranch, this life, it's all I have. I built it with that money. I won't let anyone take it from me. Not the bank, not the law, and not you. He was trapping her. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to let her leave. Ever. She was his new partner, his new alibi, the respectable rancher's wife. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. The Derringer. It was still in the box, if she could just get to it. What about my brother? She asked, trying to keep him talking. The coffee beans. What was that about? For the first time, something other than ice flickered in his eyes. Annoyance. Your brother is a fool. He was supposed to use that money to buy the coffee and pay off a debt. Instead, he got greedy. He heard I was looking for a wife, a way to look legitimate for the bank man, and he saw an opportunity. It all clicked into place. The trade wasn't real. It was a cover story Jeremiah had invented on the spot to explain why he was giving Elias a woman instead of money. And Elias had played along because it suited him. It gave him the cover he needed. So you didn't even want a wife, she breathed. I wanted a housekeeper, he corrected her coldly. Someone to make the place look right. Someone to cook for the bank man. You were a convenient solution to a number of problems. He was close now, so close she could smell the sweat and the sun on his clothes. Her back was pressed hard against the cold plaster wall. There was nowhere left to run. I need you to be a partner, Clara, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Like Sarah was. At first. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She had to make a choice. Play along. Become his prisoner. Or fight. She thought of the Derringer. She thought of Sarah's warning. She looked him straight in the eye, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard knot of defiance in her belly. No. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of surprise, then anger. He reached for her. And that's when they heard it. The sound of a horse approaching the house. Fast. Elias froze. He glanced out the window and a curse hissed through his teeth. Jackson, he muttered. He's early. The bank man. The man he'd been performing for. Elias turned back to her, his face a mask of fury. Not a word, he snarled, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. You play the dutiful wife, or I swear you'll end up right next to Sarah. He shoved her toward the door. Now go downstairs and put the coffee on. As he dragged her down the stairs, Clara's mind was screaming. This was her chance, her only chance. She could scream. She could run to Jackson. She could expose Elias for the killer he was. But then she remembered Jackson, the way Elias had described him. A man looking for any excuse to foreclose. A man who might not be a savior at all. What if Jackson was part of it? What if he was a threat, too? She was trapped between a killer and a vulture. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. They reached the bottom of the stairs just as a sharp knock echoed through the house. Elias released her arm, his expression instantly shifting back to that of the weary, hard-working rancher. It was a chilling transformation. Stay here, he ordered in a low voice, then walked to the door and opened it. Robert Jackson stood on the porch. He was a thin man, just as Elias had described, with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes. He wasn't dressed like a banker. He wore dusty trail clothes and had a pistol strapped to his hip. He looked less like a man who worked with ledgers and more like a man who collected debts. With force. "Boone," Jackson said, his voice curt. He didn't smile. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the room, lingering for a moment too long on Clara. "You weren't expecting me." "Jackson," Elias said, his tone perfectly calm. "You're a few weeks early. We were just sitting down to supper. My wife, Clara." Jackson gave Clara a dismissive nod. "Your wife," he repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Heard all about it in town. Quite the romantic story. A bag of coffee beans, wasn't it?" Clara stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. "Small towns breed small minds," Elias said, the line sounding rehearsed. Jackson ignored him. He walked further into the room, running a gloved hand along the mantel, checking for dust. His movements were predatory. He wasn't inspecting the ranch. He was searching for something. "Things look better," Jackson said, though he didn't sound pleased. "Cleaner. Almost respectable." His eyes landed on Clara again. "You've been busy. We're making improvements," Elias said. "Planning for the spring planting." Jackson laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Planning. That's good. I like a man with a plan." He stopped his pacing and turned to face Elias directly. "Speaking of plans, my employers are getting impatient. They're not interested in your spring planting, Boone. They're interested in what's under it." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Under it? Elias's face remained a stony mask. "The land is good for grazing. That's all." "Don't play dumb with me," Jackson snarled. "We know why you bought this specific patch of dirt. We know what Sarah found. She sent a letter to her cousin before her unfortunate fever." Sarah. So Sarah had tried to get word out. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elias said, but a flicker of fear finally broke through his icy composure. Jackson took a step closer to Elias, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "The geological surveys your late wife was so interested in. The ones that showed a significant silver deposit running right under this house. The bank doesn't care about your mortgage, Boone. We want the mineral rights, and we're done asking nicely." Silver. It wasn't about a farm loan. It was never about the ranch. It was a land grab. This whole charade, the looming foreclosure, it was all a tactic to scare Elias into selling for pennies on the dollar. But Elias wasn't just a rancher. He was a fugitive sitting on a fortune. "The mineral rights aren't for sale," Elias said, his voice cold as stone. Jackson's eyes narrowed. He turned his gaze to Clara. "Maybe your new wife can convince you. It would be a shame if she came down with the fever, too." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Jackson wasn't just a bank agent. He was a monster. He knew about Sarah. He might have even been involved. Elias moved, placing himself subtly between Jackson and Clara. It was a protective gesture, and it was so unexpected it threw her completely off balance. Why would he protect her? "You'll get your answer in due time, Jackson," Elias said. "Now get off my property." Jackson smirked. "I'll be back, Boone, with the sheriff and a foreclosure notice. You've got 1 week to sign over the rights. After that, all bets are off." He tipped his hat mockingly to Clara. "Ma'am." He turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. He was a killer, a liar. But he had just stood up to Jackson. He had just protected her. Nothing made sense anymore. "The silver," she whispered. "Is it true?" He turned around slowly. The mask was gone. All she saw was a man who was well and truly trapped. Yes, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. It's true. And Sarah? Pain, raw and genuine, flashed across his face. Sarah wanted to run, take the money from the robbery and the silver, and just disappear. I wanted to build something, a real life, a place they'd never find me. We fought about it, constantly. He ran a hand through his hair. The night she died, we had a terrible fight. She said she was leaving, taking our boy and the money and going to the law. She ran out of the house toward the old well. I went after her. He paused, his voice breaking. It was dark. She slipped. She hit her head on the stones. It was an accident, Clara, I swear it. I buried her and my boy out back, and I told everyone it was the fever. What else could I do? If I'd called the doctor, they'd have found out who I was. I'd have been hanged. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Could she believe him? A killer who claimed the one death on his conscience was an accident. It sounded like another convenient story. But the grief in his eyes, it looked real. The despair of a man haunted by his past, trapped by his choices. So the story about the robbery, the deputy. That's all true, she said numbly. I was young and stupid, he said bitterly. I fell in with the wrong crowd. A man was killed. It wasn't my gun, but it didn't matter. I was there. I've been running ever since. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. I know I lied to you, Clara. I was wrong. But I'm not the monster Jackson is. That man works for the railroad barons who want this land. He's not above killing to get it. He likely would have killed Sarah himself if he'd gotten the chance. Her head was spinning. Elias, the fugitive. Jackson, the corporate thug. And she was caught in the middle. What are we going to do? She asked, the word we slipping out before she could stop it. Hope flared in his eyes. Jackson gave us a week. That's a week to fight back. We can fortify the ranch. We can make a stand. Make a stand against a man like Jackson, who would surely come back with hired guns. It was suicide. But what was the alternative? Run. Where would she go? Back to her brother? To a world that saw her as worthless? Here, on this broken-down ranch, with this broken-down man, she was standing on a silver mine. She had leverage. She had power. And she had a choice. She thought of the derringer hidden upstairs. She thought of Sarah's warning. He's not who he says he is. Sarah had been right. But maybe Jackson was the real monster Sarah had been warning her about. All right, Elias, she said, her voice steady and clear. Show me how to use a rifle. Over the next 6 days, the ranch transformed. It was no longer a home. It was a fortress. They worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by black coffee and a shared, desperate purpose. Elias, it turned out, knew a lot about fortifications. He showed her how to board up the windows, leaving small slits to shoot through. They reinforced the doors, barricading them with heavy furniture. They moved supplies, water, food, ammunition, into the main room of the house. Clara was a fast learner. The meek woman who had been traded for coffee beans disappeared. In her place was a woman with a rifle in her hands and ice in her veins. She learned to load, aim, and fire until her shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing. In the quiet moments between the frantic work, they talked. Elias told her about his past, about the son he had lost, about the dreams he'd had for a peaceful life, dreams that had turned to ash. He was still a liar, still a man with blood on his ledger. But he was also just a man. Flawed, frightened, and Clara started to see the person behind the fugitive. She didn't trust him. Not completely. But she trusted Jackson and his employers even less. This was no longer about Elias's past. It was about her future. She would not be a victim again. She would not be traded or threatened or brushed aside. This land, this silver, it was her chance to be free. On the 7th day they waited. The sun rose, painting the prairie in hues of orange and pink. The air was still. The world held its breath. Clara stood at one of the upstairs windows, rifle in hand. Elias was downstairs, watching the front. They saw the dust cloud first, a long rising plume on the horizon. It wasn't just one rider. It was at least 5. Jackson was back, and he'd brought friends. "They're here," Elias called up to her, his voice tight. "I see them," she replied, her own voice betraying none of the fear that was churning in her stomach. The riders approached slowly, confidently. They stopped just out of rifle range. Jackson was in the lead, flanked by 4 rough-looking men with rifles laid across their saddles. They looked like hired guns. Killers. "Boone," Jackson's voice carried on the still morning air. "Time's up. Sign the deed, or we burn you out." Elias didn't answer. "Have it your way," Jackson yelled. He gave a signal, and his men dismounted, spreading out, using the dilapidated fence and the old water trough for cover. The first shot shattered the morning's silence. It splintered the wood of the window frame, just inches from Clara's head. She didn't flinch. She just raised her rifle, took aim at one of the hired guns, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The man cried out and dropped, clutching his leg. One down. The fight had begun. Gunfire erupted from both sides. The quiet ranch became a war zone. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the house. Glass shattered. Clara and Elias moved from window to window, firing methodically, making every shot count. They were outnumbered, but they had cover. They had the advantage. For an hour they held them off. The initial confidence of Jackson's men began to waver. They were used to intimidating unarmed farmers, not fighting a pitched battle. Then Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the men was sneaking around the side of the house, toward the barn. He was carrying a torch. "Elias!" she screamed. "The barn! They're going to set it on fire!" The barn was old and dry as tinder. If it went up, the fire could easily spread to the house. They would be smoked out, cooked alive. "I see him!" Elias yelled back. "Keep them pinned down!" He moved to a window on the side of the house, taking aim. He fired. The man with the torch stumbled, but he didn't fall. He tossed the torch onto the loose hay piled against the barn wall. The hay ignited instantly. Flames roared to life, licking up the side of the old, weathered wood. Panic seized Clara. They were trapped. The fire would force them out into a hail of bullets. It was over. But then something unexpected happened. From the direction of the main road, another rider appeared. He was riding hard, his horse kicking up a storm of dust. He wasn't one of Jackson's men. As he got closer, Clara could see he wore a dusty suit and a bowler hat. It was her brother, Jeremiah. What in God's name was he doing here? Jeremiah rode straight toward the battle, waving his arms frantically. "Stop!" he was yelling. "Stop shooting!" Jackson's men, confused, lowered their rifles. Jackson himself turned, his face a mask of fury at the interruption. "What is this?" Jackson roared. Jeremiah pulled his horse to a skidding halt. He looked terrified, but determined. "You can't do this," he shouted. "This isn't part of the deal." "Deal?" Jackson sneered. "The deal was, you find out what Boone was hiding. You did. Now get out of here before you get shot." "No." Jeremiah slid off his horse, holding up a piece of paper. "I went to the county clerk's office. I looked up the deed. Elias doesn't own this land. He's a squatter." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. A squatter. This whole fight. For nothing. Elias appeared in the doorway below, his rifle still in his hands. His face was pale. "What is he talking about, Elias?" Clara called down. Elias wouldn't look at her. "The deed was in Sarah's name," he said quietly. "After she died. I couldn't get it transferred without revealing who I was. I forged some papers for the bank, but the official deed is still in her name." Jackson started to laugh, a loud, triumphant laugh. You hear that, boys? He doesn't even own it. This land belongs to his dead wife's next of kin. He turned to Jeremiah, a cruel smile spreading across his face. And who might that be? Jeremiah swallowed hard. Sarah Boone, Sarah Fletcher. She was my cousin. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah, the woman in the grave, the woman who had written the warning. She was related to Jeremiah. This whole time, the land hadn't belonged to Elias at all. It belonged to her brother. Well, 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 Jackson said, his eyes gleaming with greed. This simplifies things. Sign the deed over to me, Fletcher, and I'll give you a 10% cut. And I'll forget that you conveniently forgot to mention this little fact before. Jeremiah looked from Jackson's smiling face to the burning barn, to Elias's stony expression, and finally up to the window where Clara stood. He looked at his sister, the sister he had sold, the sister who was now holding a rifle, her face smudged with gunpowder. He saw the woman she had become, and something inside him seemed to break. No, Jeremiah said, his voice shaking but firm. The land, it goes to Clara. She was married to him. By common law, she's his heir. And if Sarah was the owner, then Clara is her heir now. It's her land. Jackson's smile vanished. You sentimental fool, he hissed and raised his pistol. But he was too slow. 2 shots rang out almost at the same time, one from Elias's rifle, one from Clara's. Jackson crumpled to the ground. His men, seeing their leader fall, panicked. They scrambled for their horses, firing wildly as they retreated. Within seconds they were gone, disappearing into the dust cloud they had arrived in. Silence descended. The only sound was the roar and crackle of the burning barn. Jeremiah stood shaking, staring at Jackson's body. Elias slowly lowered his rifle, his eyes finding Clara's. It was over, but a whole new battle was just beginning. The barn burned to the ground. They couldn't save it. They could only watch as years of Elias's work, a monument to his stolen dreams, turned to black ash. The fire cast long dancing shadows as night fell. Inside the house, the 3 of them sat at the big dining table. The air was thick with smoke and unspoken words. Jeremiah wouldn't look at either of them. Elias stared into a cold cup of coffee. Clara felt a strange, hollow victory. She owned it all now. The land, the silver, the future. But it was a future built on a foundation of lies, blood, and fire. Why, Jeremiah? She finally asked, her voice raspy. Why did you come back? Why did you do it? He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was painful to see. When I made that deal with Elias, he began, his voice barely a whisper, I thought I was just getting rid of a burden. Getting you off my hands, pleasing my new wife. But then I heard the gossip in town. Not just about the coffee beans, but about Jackson, about the railroad. People said he was a ruthless man, that he'd run a dozen families off their land. He took a shaky breath. I started to worry. I knew Sarah was our cousin, but I never connected it. I went to the clerk's office this morning just to see. When I saw her name on the deed, I knew. I knew Jackson wasn't just trying to foreclose. He was trying to steal our family's land. And I had sent you right into the middle of it. I sent you to him. He buried his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, Clara. I was a fool. A greedy, cruel fool. Clara looked at her brother, this weak, selfish man who had, in the end, found a single shred of courage and done the right thing. Forgiveness was a long way off, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel hatred for him. She just felt pity. She turned her gaze to Elias. And you, she said, what now? The law will still be looking for Elijah Boone. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. I know. I'll be gone by morning. The land is yours. The silver is yours. You're safe now. You can hire people, build something real. He was going to run again, disappear into the wilderness and start over with a new name, a new lie. It was all he knew how to do. But Clara thought of the past week, of the man who had taught her to shoot, the man who had stood between her and a bullet, the man whose grief for his dead wife and child was the only true thing he'd ever told her. He was a killer and a fugitive, but was he beyond redemption? You could stay, she said quietly. Both men looked at her, stunned. Elijah Boone is a wanted man, she continued, thinking fast, but no one is looking for Elias Boone, a simple rancher who lost his wife and child to a fever, a man who just defended his home from railroad thugs. Jackson and his men won't be talking to the law. They'll just disappear. No one will ever know what really happened here today. Elias stared at her, a storm of emotions in his eyes, hope, fear, disbelief. They'll find me eventually. Maybe, she said, or maybe they won't. Maybe Elijah Boone died a long time ago in San Antonio. Maybe all that's left is Elias Boone, and maybe he deserves a second chance. It was a risk, a huge risk, harboring a fugitive, building a life on one last great lie. But her entire life had been dictated by the rules and judgments of others, her value measured by her womb, her obedience, her silence. Now, for the first time, she was making her own rules. The silver will be enough to pay off the bank, bribe a few officials to make the paperwork on the deed ironclad, she said, her voice growing stronger, more confident. It will be enough to hire hands, buy cattle, rebuild the barn. It will be enough to build a real ranch. Our ranch. She looked from Elias's stunned face to Jeremiah's tear-streaked one. This is what's going to happen. Jeremiah, you will go back to town. You will tell everyone that Jackson and his men tried to run us off the land, and we defended ourselves. You will be the grieving cousin who came to check on his widowed kin. You will make sure the story is told right. Jeremiah nodded, wiping his eyes. I will. And you, Elias, she said, turning back to him. You will stay. You will help me build this place. Not as my owner, not as a lie, but as my partner. For real this time. We'll face whatever comes, together. Silence fell over the room once more. It was a different kind of silence now. Not of fear, but of possibility. Of a future that was unwritten. Elias finally raised his head, and for the first time the storm clouds in his eyes seemed to part. A little bit of light shone through. Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to finish. She understood. In the heart of Texas, on a ranch bought with blood money and baptized in fire, two broken people, a traded wife and a fugitive husband, made a choice. They chose not to run from the past, but to build a future on its ashes. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't a simple story of redemption. It was messy and dangerous and built on a lie, but it was theirs. Clara May Fletcher, now Clara May Boone, had been traded for a bag of coffee, but in the end she had gained a kingdom. The story of the Boone Ranch became a local legend, a tale of brave settlers who stood up to the railroad and won. And as the years went by, the ranch prospered. The silver was a secret they took to their graves, a foundation hidden deep beneath the earth. They rebuilt the barn, bigger and stronger than before. They raised the finest cattle in the county, and they created a home, a sanctuary, a place where two souls branded by the world as worthless found their own value together. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell too, because you never know when the next dark tale is going to drop. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have run or would you have stayed to fight?